is a very important issue, and I think in a lot of the larger defense discussions going on today, it gets overlooked, quite frankly. People focus on the major platforms, the major weapon systems that you see every day, and they don't realize or forget about the things up in space that actually make those systems work and make them operationally useful. And so that's why I was excited to do this study and focus on something that's near and dear to my heart that I've worked on in the past. It gets beyond sequestration for a while. I'll start by just going back in time a bit. For much of the Cold War, we were in a stable competition in space with the Soviet Union, and our space systems really had to focus on supporting the strategic mission, things like missile warning, intelligence, nuclear command and control. But things have changed since the end of the Cold War. Today, it's not just a competition between the United States and Soviet Union. There are more than 40 nations now own or operate satellites, and just about every nation on Earth depends on space-based capabilities for everything from weather forecasting to GPS to communications. But the real point now is not only is space more crowded, it's more contested. Other nations, China among them, have developed capabilities to attack our space systems by various means. And so, as the space environment has changed, it's gotten more crowded, more contested, the way that we use space has also changed. We are much more dependent, we are increasingly dependent on space-based capabilities, and Milsatcom in particular, to enable our warfighters. I think you've referred to this as a space-enabled reconnaissance strike complex. I think that's a great way to look at it. But the problem is that as the space environment has changed, our systems, and Milsatcom systems in particular, have not really been keeping up. And so I think a good analogy here is actually the Maginot Line. And so if you think back after World War I, the French built the Maginot Line of fortifications because they wanted to prevent a German invasion of their territory. And it was technologically advanced for its time. It was a remarkable feat of engineering. If you look at what they built for the time, built 100 feet below the ridge lines, had an underground trolley system, it was self-sufficient with food and supplies for about 3 months. It even had a filtration system and an overpressure to protect them from chemical weapons attack. It was a significant improvement over the previous generation, the trench warfare of World War I. And it provided an impressive level of protection from a specific threat, a direct German invasion through the Alsace and Lorraine regions. The problem is that they failed to anticipate how warfare would change, how the next war would be fundamentally different than the past war. And I think right now the United States is actually at risk of building a Maginot Line in space. Whereas through much of the Cold War, our systems were designed mainly with a strategic conflict in mind. And for that, the key type of protection you needed for Milsatcom systems was nuclear survivability. And not all Milsatcom systems needed that protection, only the ones that you needed for nuclear command and control. And an implicit assumption in that is that in a conventional conflict, deterrence will hold, and our space systems won't attack. So really, you're protecting your systems for a specific type of attack, nuclear. And so for generations, we've been building successive generations of technologically advanced satellites that each one is a significant improvement over the previous generation, provides a great level of protection for a specific type of threat. But the problem is, just like with the French building the Maginot Line, that assumes that future will be like the past. We're already seeing indications that that's just not the case. Just as Germans violated international norms by attacking through Luxembourg and Belgium and sidestepping the Maginot Line, we run the risk, we have the vulnerability that our space systems that are not adequately protected could be attacked in the same way. Now, if you talk about these threats, and I apologize, I'm going to have to skim through some of this. Obviously, there's more detail in the full report, but I want to limit myself to 20 minutes so we can get to the discussion. But if you look at all the threats out there to Milsatcom systems, I divide them into 3 categories, just as a way of framing the discussion here. The first are the physical attacks, and that's what most people think about when they think about attacks against space systems. They think about things like kinetic anti-satellite weapons, going up there, blowing up in space, hitting our satellites. But there's also other forms of physical attack. Directed energy weapons can be used against our satellites to cause physical effects. High-powered laser, high-powered microwave type weapons. Also, keep in mind is physical attacks can happen on the ground as well, against the ground segment. You know, just conventional attacks, even, you know, something more like a terrorist attack against that teleport site, against, you know, various segments on the ground, could have devastating effects and cut off our ability to communicate. And some of those systems could take quite a while to replace, and we're critically dependent in some areas on our ground segment. The next form of attack here, electronic attack, basically what I'm talking about here is jamming. It could be either uplink jamming or downlink jamming. You know, it's remarkably easy relative to other forms of attack to do jamming, and we see that out there. I mean, if you just go online and do a quick search, you can find all sorts of jammers you can buy commercially. You know, everything from GPS jammers, you name it, cell phone jammers. Well, you know, jamming satellites is really not that different, and so that really represents an asymmetric threat to our space system since it's so cheap and so readily available. The third form of attack here is cyber attack, and so what I'm talking about here is cyber attack. I distinguish that from electronic attack. Electronic attack is where someone's going after the RF signal. Cyber attack is where someone's going after the data itself. You know, there are different levels of cyber attacks that require different levels of sophistication. At the most basic level, if someone can just get into your data stream and monitor or detect who is communicating, who is transmitting, and who are they transmitting to. And that in itself is valuable information, even if they can't see the data. The next level of sophistication would be to actually get in there and intercept the data and be able to read it and exploit it for operational purposes. And of course, a most severe form of cyber attack is if someone gets into your command and control link and can actually take control of your satellite. And that is a real possibility, and that's something we have to be guarded against. Now, you know, this slide here, basically, you've got to put all of this in context. There are all kinds of threats out there to Milsatcom systems, but they're not all the same priority. They can't be, and not everything can be your top priority. And in a budget-constrained environment like we're in now, I mean, let's be honest about this. We're not going to have TSAT levels of funding going forward. We're not going to have current levels of funding for space systems going forward. We're going to have less. We're going to have less money. That is the reality. So we cannot try to build systems that protect against all of these threats. It is just not going to be affordable. We're going to have to prioritize, and we're going to have to select where do we want to buy down risk, where do we want to improve our protection, and where are we going to be willing to accept a little more risk. And it's, you know, people don't like to talk about accepting risk, but it's a reality in a constrained environment. Now, of course, while all of the threats are important to consider, I think a good framework of looking at this is, well, what's the potential impact of a threat? You know, is it large in scale? Is it long in duration? Kinetic ASAT weapon, I think, is obviously at the extreme of this because it would be catastrophic to the space system, and not only to that space system, to anything else in that orbital plane. And it would be long in duration because the satellite is gone, and it's going to take a long time to replace it. The other thing to consider is what's the relative likelihood of this type of threat? How difficult is it to do? What kind of resources are required? And is it attributable? Those are all factors that go into figuring out how likely a threat is. Things like, you know, cyber attack and jamming even can be pretty difficult to attribute to someone. And I think that actually makes it more likely it'll occur if someone believes they can do it and get away with it without us being sure who did it. And so you plot these on an axis like this, and I fully confess that this is completely subjective how you rate these things, but it nevertheless is a good framework for figuring out how do we prioritize these things. And so this is my subjective assessment here of how I think these different threats fall on this kind of risk matrix. The upper right-hand quadrant, the things that have the highest potential impact and the highest relative likelihood, those are the things that should be your top priority, the things you really need to focus on. I think it's jamming, uplink jamming in particular, and I think it's ground segment attack. I think we've got to be concerned about that, and seizure of satellite control, the most severe kind of cyber attack. And so I think in the next generation architecture, those are the things that we've really got to focus on in terms of protection. Those have got to be the priority for our investments. Now, how do you protect your Milsatcom system? There are a lot of different options, a lot of different ways you can protect against these threats. And so I'll try to go through these briefly. And these are not things that are mutually exclusive. You could, in some cases, do all of the above. But again, the problem is you don't have unlimited money. So you got to pick and choose what are the most cost-effective options to address the highest priority threats. So starting on the upper left-hand side, you can improve your defenses of your space systems. Passive defenses are things that allow the systems to survive and operate through an attack. These are things like using frequency hopping spread spectrum in your waveform, using antenna nullers, things like interleaving in your waveform, inter-satellite crosslinks, hardening your satellites for EMP, and even more simple things like data encryption. All of those are forms of passive defenses. Active defenses are things where you actually try to defeat a threat before it can affect your systems. So an example would be like a shoot-back system in space. You see an anti-satellite weapon coming up, you try to shoot it before it gets to your satellite. You could also use escort satellites to achieve the same thing. And also active defenses could include activities on the ground, trying to attack the source of threats to your systems on the ground before they can actually hit your satellites in space. I would offer a note of caution on your active defenses. Well, number one, if you're doing shoot-back, you still got an orbital debris problem, depending on what altitude you intercept. But if you're trying to protect a geosatellite, you could still end up with a real orbital debris problem at lower orbits. The other thing, too, to consider is, there's actually a cost exchange ratio here for some of these things. And it's a shoot-back system for space systems actually is much like missile defense systems when you think about it. What is the cost to intercept those missiles, and what's the cost of the attacking missile? And if the cost of defeating that missile, the cost of your intercept, the marginal cost, is much higher than the cost of attack, then you're on the losing end of a cost-imposing strategy. And so if you just think about that, if you put a shoot-back system on space, how many rounds have you got? And how quickly can you fire them? And as soon as your adversary figures that out, they'll just build more ASAT weapons and they'll spin you into the ground. As you keep trying to add more shoot-back capability on space, they can just buy more ASAT weapons at a lower cost. Now, cost-imposing strategies can be great when they work to your advantage, but you certainly don't want to be on the losing end of it. Another option here, disaggregate, disperse, and proliferate. A lot of times people throw these in together. They're different things, really. Disaggregation is splitting up capabilities so you don't have multiple missions dependent on the same constellation of satellites, so breaking up your capabilities. TSAT, for example, was aggregating more and more capabilities onto a satellite, so this is going in the opposite direction. Dispersing capabilities, you can do that by distributing payloads across a larger number of satellites, using things like hosted payloads. Make a smaller version of your payload for a particular type of SATCOM capability, and put that on more satellites up in the sky. Proliferation is just basically buying more of the same systems and putting them up there. Now, each of these options would increase the difficulty of an attack on your space systems because you've just given more targets that someone has to hit. And so they have to hit more of these targets to achieve the same effect than if you had a less disaggregated, dispersed, and proliferated constellation. The problem, though, there is, again, if an adversary has a deep inventory of ASAT munitions, if they can hit one satellite, maybe they could hit 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, we've quickly crossed a line there in space warfare where you would be generating so much debris that you may make entire orbital planes useless to anyone at that point. Third option here on the lower left, make systems easier to replace. So ideally, you would design your constellation to be smaller, less expensive, procure satellites in larger quantities at a regular production rate. There are all kinds of advantages in terms of the industry side of things to doing that. But I would offer a note of caution here. In a short duration conflict, so talking something that lasts days or weeks, if your satellite gets taken out on orbit, you're not going to have time to replace it. Just integrating a satellite with a launch vehicle, launching it, going through all the checkout and everything, positioning in the right orbit, you're probably not going to have a replacement within the operational time frame in a short duration conflict. In a protracted conflict, you run the risk of, if you lose a satellite early, do you really want to launch a replacement? Because if they could take out the first one, they could take out the replacement too. And then if you keep doing that, you know, you quickly end up on the wrong side of a cost-imposing strategy, because I can guarantee you that your replacement satellites are going to cost more than whatever system your adversary is using to take them out. So they could, even in peacetime, in this kind of competition, they could spin you into the ground by building more ASAT weapons, and then you have to build more replacement satellites you have to keep in inventory. So I'm not so sure that making systems easier to replace really is a viable option. Alternatives to Milsatcom. There are a lot of alternatives out there, and they have advantages, but they also have weaknesses. Commercial SATCOM, obviously, we rely heavily on commercial SATCOM today. I think in Afghanistan, our forces, about 80% of the bandwidth is provided by commercial SATCOM, just because we don't have the bandwidth on our military systems. Of course, the problem there is commercial SATCOMs are you know, at least today, the way that we're doing it, they're not built to have the kind of protection that I think we're going to need in the future. Protection from, you know, different forms of jamming, protection from cyber attacks. Now, you know, folks in the commercial SATCOM industry would argue, hey, we could build in some of that to our systems, but they've got to get the demand signal from DoD, and that takes a long time to do, and that's something that's probably worth exploring. Another alternative to Milsatcom is an aerial layer. That's been talked about a lot. I think it has a lot of utility in some circumstances. The problem, though, is you think ahead to an anti-access area denial environment, A2AD environment, where we don't own the air, we don't own the ground, we're trying to fight our way in to a contested environment. How are you going to fly in these airborne nodes in a contested environment? You can make the aircraft as stealthy as you want. It's going to be a prolific emitter in the RF spectrum. It will be easy to find. And so you're not going to be able to operate an aerial layer unless you already have air superiority. And the range of an aerial layer, you know, if you just fly up to the edge of where you have control of the airspace, you know, you're only looking 100, you know, 200 nautical miles inland that you could possibly get out of that. So it's not a complete replacement. The other thing, too, is aerial layer is regional, and it takes a lot of nodes to keep in the air, and a high operational cost when you're keeping them in the air. It doesn't provide global coverage, and also people know when you're doing it, so they know when you put up a net that you're doing operations. So for forces like Special Operations Forces, that's not exactly an appealing option. Autonomy and store and forward. So basically the idea here is let's cut back on how much we actually need to use SATCOM to get data out. Let's put more autonomy on board our ISR platforms in particular, so maybe they don't need to transmit a real-time, you know, high-definition video feed out of there. Maybe they could process the image on board, and when there's something of interest, then they transmit it. Store and forward approach would be complementary as well. And we actually use this on things like Gorgon Stare. They already produce more data than they can transmit in real time. So the idea is you just store the data on board. When you land, then you download it. Or maybe when you move out of contested airspace, then you start transmitting it. You know, those are all options, but you know, the problem again is, you know, there are some missions where you need real-time information. And so you've got to be transmitting that data in real time, and so you're going to need the capacity of Milsatcom and the range that Milsatcom gives you. Terrestrial, obviously, is great use once you own the ground, but if you're in a contested land environment where you can't set up towers and operate like that, then it's not going to be of much use to you. So, you know, overall, I think there actually are few viable alternatives to Milsatcom for key mission areas in the future. And in the report, I go into more detail on some of these key mission areas, but you know, things like global surveillance and strike, things like Special Operations Forces, and your strategic forces, there really aren't good alternatives to Milsatcom. This is a domain where we are going to have to fight our way back as it gets more and more contested. Now, recommendations in my report, I won't go through each of these in detail. I'll just hit some of the highlights here. The first recommendation is, I think we've got to break this mindset that we have right now of a protected and non-protected architecture. And that's the way we talk about it often in Milsatcom. And in reality, there are degrees of protection. It's not all or nothing. And so I think we've got to start focusing on, well, you know, we actually need a higher degree of protection for many of our tactical users who aren't able to get that protection right now. How do we build that middle layer of protection? There are many ways you could do this. One of the ways I point out in here is, hey, you could take something like the advanced EHF payload and host it on other satellites. Now, it does not give you all the protection that you need for strategic forces. That's fine. You still need your advanced EHF constellation. Not saying you change that. We've already bought it, in fact. So, you know, just finding ways to add a middle layer where you can expand protected capacity, even if it's at a lower level of protection, to cover more users and try to do it in an affordable way. It's still going to cost you. How do you pay for it? Well, I think that lowest level, you know, our wideband and narrowband systems that we think of as unprotected today, we could shift more to buying those as a service rather than buying the systems. Basically, entering into novel leasing agreements with commercial industry, you know, where we give them a good demand signal, we give them some guarantees, and we're not just buying off the spot market anymore, but fundamentally change the way we approach leasing our wideband and narrowband capacity. I think you can generate enough savings in there to help fund building out a middle tier protection in your architecture. The second point I want to highlight, you know, overall in our defense strategy, if you look at the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, it's talking about a pivot to the Pacific. We're going to focus more on the Asia-Pacific region. I think we've got to do the same thing in space, and particularly in our protected Milsatcom systems. We need to pivot to the Pacific, and I'm talking specifically here about, you know, we've already brought partners into the advanced EHF program, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Canada. That's great. We need to be bringing in some Pacific partners as well. We need to be bringing in Japan, Korea, Australia into our protected Milsatcom programs. And so there are ways to do that that also help us build out a middle tier of protection. You think if we're going to be doing hosted advanced EHF-like payloads, maybe we can do some of that with our international partners. Bringing these countries in, maybe they would agree to host a payload on one of their satellites or fund a hosted payload. And that could end up being a win-win situation for all of us. Save us money, give them capability that they otherwise wouldn't have, and help our forces be more interoperable in the region. Third point, I won't belabor this, but avoid strategic cost traps, avoid going down the path, as I talked about, where a cost-imposing strategy could be used against us. Too often, we ignore the fact that, you know, we could be outspent on some of these things, or others could force us to outspend ourselves. And I think we're really at risk of doing that in the future, given where the budget is headed. Fourth point, avoid new program starts. As much as possible, I think in the next generation architecture, we've got to avoid starting new programs. There are tremendous pitfalls, as TSAT taught us, to starting a brand new program. And I don't think that our acquisition system has been fixed in the intervening time. And I think that we're likely to fall into the same pitfalls. So I think we've got to be thinking more in this constrained budget environment about how do we evolve things we've already developed? How do we take technologies we've already developed and make minor changes and use them in different ways and use them more cost effectively to build out the future architecture? Using competition more appropriately can be part of that. Too often, I think, and folks on the Hill are guilty of this, DoD is pushed to compete everything, that everything needs to be a competition. And in reality, not everything does need to be a competition, and sometimes it can backfire on you if you try to compete something, because you're forcing competition in a situation where it does not necessarily make sense, and you're having to pay for two competing companies in industry to build similar capabilities, and then you're down selecting to one. And that's not a healthy way to sustain your industrial base in the long run. The last one here is probably most controversial within DoD. I think we really need to consolidate the Milsatcom enterprise. Right now it's spread out, it's so diffuse. People think of the Air Force as being the lead for it. For the space segments, it's not even the lead for all of the space segments. The Navy does MUOS, they do narrowband satellites. DISA does leasing. All of the services do part of the terminal architecture. They all build their own terminal programs. So I think, you know, if we're going to make sense of this and rationalize it and do things, you know, get in a situation where we could have a hope of synchronization between our terminals and our space segment, I think we've got to consolidate that authority and consolidate the budgets under one enterprise. I think the Air Force is the logical place to do that. I know that, you know, some people may be reluctant to give that to the Air Force, given kind of recent history, quite frankly, with programs. But I think this is a critical thing that we need to do to get ourselves in a good position going forward. Just final thought here. If we're serious about this pivot to the Pacific, if we're serious about we've got to maintain, as I highlighted here, a quote from the Defense Strategic Guidance, if we're going to maintain our ability to project power in an A2AD environment, then we've got to focus on what it says, enhancing the resiliency and effectiveness of our critical space-based capabilities. Milsatcom obviously is one of those critical capabilities. The problem, of course, is that we can't just do this by continuing as we've done business in the past, because we don't have unlimited funds. We've never had unlimited funds, but now we really realize it. The budget is tightening on us, and so I think we've got to fundamentally rethink the next generation of Milsatcom and be willing to make some of these difficult trades. That's all I have.
Wow. Thanks a lot. That was very nice.